Pollination. Pollination is nothing but the transfer of pollen to the stigma. That is transfer of pollen from anther to the stigma of the flower. This pollination is broadly classified into two types. One is self-pollination and the other one is cross-pollination. Self-pollination can also be categorized into two types, that is autogamy and the other is getenogamy. Getenogamy. Now we'll talk about self-pollination. Self-pollination is the pollination which is occurring in the same plant. In autogamy, if the transfer of pollen occurs, in the same flower of the same plant. I repeat once again, in autogamy the transfer of pollen will occur to the stigma of the same flower of the same plant. Then it's termed as autogamy, and autogamy is a type of self-pollination. In getenogamy, transfer of pollen will occur to stigma of another flower of the same plant. So here you get the difference. In autogamy we are talking about the same flower, and in getenogamy we are talking about the another flower, but in both of them we are having the same plant. So we can say that in both of these self-pollination, the pollen and the egg will have exact genetic composition because we are taking the same plant. Now here we can say that the plant can have unisexual flowers. So when the plant will have unisexual flowers, so the pollen from one flower will come onto the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Okay, like there is a plant and these are the two flowers, we can say. Now this plant is having unisexual flowers. So this is the male flower which is having the anther, that is the bilobed anther, and this is the other flower, that is a female flower. So it is the same plant, but the anther from this flower will dehisce and the pollen from this flower will come and land on the stigma of this female flower. So in getenogamy this autogamy is prevented. This is the male flower. So when we are talking about self-pollination, we are talking about the same plant. That is, here the genetic composition in the pollen and the egg will be exact same. That will be the genetic complement will be exact same. Now when we talk about cross-pollination, cross-pollination is also called as xenogamy or allogamy. Here we will say that cross-pollination is the transfer Cross pollination is the transfer of pollen to stigma, transfer of pollen to stigma of two plants of the same species. Here I'll make it more clear that transfer of pollen from a flower of a plant will come in contact with the stigma of a flower of another plant. So here we are talking about two flowers and two plants. Okay, so here the genetic composition of the two plants will be different. They should be of same species, that is common sense, but the genetic composition will be different, and so here we will see many variation, and that's why it's important that the organisms undergo cross pollination or cross fertilization, that is a means of sexual reproduction, so that the organisms will have better variations, and these variations will help the organism to adapt to the environment. So it would be like, this is a plant which is having the male flower, okay, and this is the another plant of the same species having the female flower. So this is the anther. Now the pollen will land on the stigma of another plant here. So this is what cross pollination. When we were talking about self pollination, this is getenogamy, and autogamy will be, this is a flower which is having what? Which is having anther, and this is the stigma part. So the pollen will be shedded on the stigma of the same flower and the same plant. So pollination can be broadly classified into self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination, we have autogamy and getenogamy. Autogamy is transfer of pollen in the same flower of the same plant, and getenogamy is a transfer of pollen from the anther of one flower to stigma of another flower but of the same plant. And in cross-pollination, we have transfer of the pollen to the stigma will occur between two plants. So there will be necessity that the pollen will be shedded from one plant and it will go on the stigma of the other plant, and that will be cross pollination. Now we can say that when the pollen has to move to another plant, there will be requirement of some agencies or some agencies of pollination. These are various agencies which will help in pollination. Now the first one is anemophily, and the pollinating agent here is air. So there are some characteristics of the flowers, pollen and stigma which are necessary for the pollinating agent to work. So the flowers have exerted stigma and anther, that is we can see the stigma and anther will be seen from a long distance so that they can easily grab the pollen. Now the pollen grains are light, small, dry and unwettable. Stigma is hairy, feathery or branched so that it can catch a maximum number of pollen, and pollen grains are light, small and dry because they have to be transported by air. So they should be light, small, dry and unwettable. Now the second one is hydrophily. This is the pollination by water. The agency for pollination is water. Here the flowers are small and inconspicuous, means it's not necessary that they are visible. They don't have any nectar or odor, and pollen grains are small, lightweight, non-sticky, and they are coated by wax. They are coated by wax because they have to travel through the medium, that is water. So they don't get wet and settle, so they are coated by wax. And stigma are long, sticky, and they are also unwettable. Now the third agency is insects, and this type of pollination is called entomophily. Here the flowers produce specific odor to attract insects. The pollen grain have the outer surface that is rough, spiny, because so that the pollen grain can get easily attached with the surface of the insect, and it bears a yellow oily sticky substance, that is pollen kit, and this pollen kit would also help in the attachment of the pollen with the body surface of the insects. Now the fourth one is ornithophily, that is the pollination by birds. Here the flowers have tubular corolla, that is tube like structure will be formed so that the birds can easily visit. Now the birds will visit for what? Nectar. Okay, nectar and pollen. So the flowers have tubular corollas, bright colored, so that they can easily attract the birds, and they produce a large quantity of nectar and pollen that can serve as food for birds, and in turn the birds will do what? That is the pollination. And the last one is chiroptophily, that is the pollination by bats. Now these flowers are also large, dull colored, and have strong scent which will attract the bats. Flowers will only open after dusk, as we know the routine of bats, that they are nocturnal animals. So these flowers will also open after dusk, and at the same time the anthers will be releasing pollen, that is the dehiscence of anther will also be there at the same time, and the pollen grains which will be released will be in abundant quantities.